elder abuse attorney and author Michael Hackard is here today to talk about his new book, Alzheimer's, Widowed Stepmothers, and Estate Crimes. Michael, welcome back to Prudent Money.
Thank you for having me back, Bob.
You know, it's all about the money. And money can bring about I know that you see this, the absolute worst in people. And especially during already difficult situations such as Alzheimer's or death of a parent. And I guess you find that most people who didn't commit the estate crime didn't even see it coming.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. People always, in these kind of cases, just express surprise. It's like they didn't see it coming. They can't, and even when it's come, they have a hard time believing it. Of course, particularly siblings feel that way, but it also happens when families have been taken advantage of by caregivers or neighbors. It's a surprise.
Well, and I appreciate your passion for this subject because, I'm a big believer in that you talk about these things on the program, and I have people like yourself come on and talk about it, and this gives the listeners an idea of what to look out for and where to get more information so that hey, this is something that doesn't look right, and I need to do a little bit more investigation.
Yeah, you're right. And we could talk about that in terms of how to spot financial abuse, some of the things to look for, and what are some common stories that you see in this area.
Well, let's start with disinheritance. A person has every right to cut someone out of their will or inheritance. Give some examples of when the disinherited have a case and when they don't have one.
The primary examples have to do with undue influence or changes in estate plans when someone, like with Alzheimer's, who lacks capacity. Not all Alzheimer's patients lack capacity, but the idea of undue influence is very old. It goes back into our common law, and it basically means excessive persuasion that causes another person to act or refrain from acting by overcoming that person's free will and results ultimately in inequity. So where you see it arise often are people, maybe they lack capacity, or maybe they're simply disabled, or they're lonely, or they're isolated, they have dependent problems or emotional distress, and someone takes advantage of that, someone close to them. So oftentimes where you see it in families that have been together over the years and that are loving families is in the last times, or maybe it's the last year, or it could be last week, but that there is someone close to the person who is very ill and convinces that person that everyone else has abandoned them, and that there's only one person that stands between them and being ousted and out on the street, and that's the person, of course, who wants to take everything. And that happens with some frequency. Now, of course, I see it because that's the practice that we're in. So, but it's surprising how many people will have stories and they'll say, well, yeah, that didn't happen to my own family, but it happened to my neighbor, or it happened to somebody that, I'm teaching with or whatever. But it's fairly common.
So that's a tough situation, obviously, Michael, and I don't know that most people would even, they'd be pretty hurt, pretty mad. I would assume that it happened. I mean, what kind of steps do you take legally if something like that happens? I mean, how do you even prove it?
Yeah, great question. And that's why I think it happens with frequency, is because it is very tough to prove. But the kind of things that you'll often see is isolation. So you see maybe it's a grandparent, or maybe it's a parent that you're normally close to, and they have a caregiver who basically says when you call, they're sleeping, you can't talk to them. Or if you show up at the door, oh, they're sleeping. Or maybe it just gets outright and says they don't want to talk to you. Or when you show up at the house, the caregiver is always there, listens in on everything. And another common occurrence is that there's a baby monitor in the room where the elderly person is. So everything that person says is basically overheard by the caregiver. So that's isolation. There are various ways to report it, and I'm not going to say they're all successful because they aren't, but most states have adult protective services statutes, so you can ask adult protective services to go look in on the person. In those areas in our country where, say, law enforcement is more proactive, you can actually call law enforcement and say, I'm afraid that my mother is being taken advantage of. Will you please stop by? I've seen that successful a few times, but more often than not, truly the only inquiry that law enforcement can make is, are you okay? And of course, the elderly person who's somewhat cognitively impaired is likely to say, I'm okay. They're not going to say, well, my caregiver's cutting me off. They may not even know it.
Now, I would assume that if this happens to an individual, that these cases are somewhat time sensitive. I mean, you've got to take action fairly quick. How does that work?
Yeah, it is. It's very helpful to take action quickly. There are different ways to take action, as I said about APS and law enforcement. The other thing is try to get together a family meeting of all family members that are involved with the senior or elder, so that maybe with everyone there they can address it and ask for transparency, seek transparency, seek out what bills, what unpaid bills the elder has, and what other are there checks out there with unfamiliar signatures and those kinds of things. That's certainly one way. Recently, I've seen more and more families that will actually hire investigators, and they'll go out and find. I've had this one happen where you say you're looking, they're investigating a caregiver and find out that the caregiver and or a sibling of the caregiver did a similar action 4 or 5 years ago to someone else. So that can help. And I recently spoke to a group of investigators here in California, and so many of them identified that they wanted to learn this area because they heard from people more and more that they needed the assistance of investigators.
This is Bob Brooks, and you are listening to the Prudent Money Radio Show. Thank you so much for joining me today, talking to attorney and author Michael Hackard about his book, Alzheimer's, Widowed, Stepmothers, and Estate Crimes. This is a good book. This really gets you up the curve on what you need to know if you're in a situation like this, just what to be careful about, what to look out for, and what you need to know. If you want more information, you can always go to hackardlaw.com. Now, Michael, you mentioned a unique situation where there's cognitive decline. And let's just say, we'll say a grandfather simply mistakenly left someone out of the will. I mean, what do you do if that happens?
If it's a simple mistake,
pretty common.
It is, and it's even, you see it occasionally where people are misnamed, because someone with cognitive impairments forgotten the name of their grandchild or even their child. Those are harder to cure if there wasn't active involvement of a wrongdoer. But where you had active involvement of wrongdoers, was saying, well, by not including my sister Susie, I'm going to get that much more. And then it's easier to overcome on the basis of undue influence.
Let's talk a little bit about blended families. And this is one of the conversations that I have when I'm talking to somebody that hasn't necessarily taken care of their estate planning and second marriage. Talk about the potential problems, just in case that there's somebody listening who hasn't really thought through this. Because if you go without doing estate planning, you really could create a lot of problems.
Yeah, I'll talk about it because, I'm not picking on widowed stepmothers, so let me start with that. But let me also point out, just statistically, women are living longer than men. I was born in 1950, and now I'm supposed to live 10 years longer than I was supposed to live in 1950. I'm thankful for that. That's right. And but there are 11 million widowed stepmothers in this country and less than 3 million widowed stepfathers. So the more typical scenario is this, say in a second or even a third marriage. Now, if it's a long marriage, so say the second marriage is 35 years, then it's not going to be entirely surprising that say children of the second marriage are going to receive a good part of the estate on the death of the survivor. And we're going to assume for these purposes the survivor's the widowed stepmother. So what happens, though, is there's some statistics. Only about 20% of children get along with their stepmother. And so you oftentimes see estates where the father or the father, biological father of the first family, changes his estate plan near the end of his life, sometimes to just benefit the stepmother, we're going to call her the stepmother, solely benefit her, and then other times to benefit her or her children and cut out all the biological children from the first marriage. And there are a lot of celebrity cases like that, but that's more common are people that you and I know and run into all the time, and that's a major problem. That whole stepmother problem. And that's the reason I write about it, because at one point I looked at my practice and I saw about 50% of the cases had to do with stepmothers.
Yeah, you write about Alzheimer's, and that's something that's near and dear to my heart because I watched my mom go through it. And, let's say that when the individual is of sound mind, the Alzheimer's hasn't really become an issue yet, and they can make decisions on their own. They write up the will and or a trust. And you would think that, well, everything was taken care of just the way that he or she wanted things to occur. So what could go wrong?
Yeah,
and you're thinking that really everything is all tied up, but what could go wrong, Michael?
Yeah, what could and what does go wrong is as they lose their memory, their short-term memory. So they've got impaired cognitive ability, and what happens is again they might even forget that for 40 years in their life they'd always were going to provide for their children, their biological children, but during the last months of their life, when maybe the biological children have been cut out and they're only dealing with one child or with a caregiver, that's their complete life at that point. And if they are going to be taken advantage of and they have a lawyer that will do it, and I'm always very critical of that, but nevertheless, there are lots of lawyers that'll make those changes. But then their life's very limited, and they see that caregiver or the sole child, whoever it is, as the sole beneficiary of their estate. I've been working on this area because it's so common, and there are a few things that leading estate planners in the country say that you can do. And one of them is, while the person has cognition, is for that person to appoint a trust protector. Now, that trust protector could be their most trusted child, and the trust protector, it could basically be that the trust shall not be amended without the consent of the trust protector. So you kind of have an insurance policy built in there so that even if you're kind of going off the rails, or for me, I'm going off the rails, that I have some trusted person who says, Mike, you can't change that trust without my consent. And that's a little bit of an insurance policy which helps.
It's really interesting to hear you talk about this, because I think, and I would fall in the same spot. I would just assume, which is not a good thing, that everything would be just fine. It's almost like you put a lock and key on the estate planning, because while they were of sound mind, then they're not of sound mind, so nothing can change. But you're saying, hey, happens all the time. And what's even more disturbing is that there's attorneys that I can't remember what word I'm looking for. can take care of the doctor up the paperwork or whatever they need to do to make that happen.
Right. We take depositions of attorneys all the time, and there are lots of people like to beat up on attorneys, so I don't want to just beat up on attorneys. But it always surprises me when you just see the crazy things that some attorneys will do, such as change an amendment from someone who doesn't speak English. I recently had that one. And so a trust attorney, puts together a very sophisticated document in English, and to say a Spanish speaker, he is not a Spanish speaker and can't explain the document to the Spanish speaker. So in that particular case brings in an assistant who only speaks a little Spanish, probably about like me, and enough to count. And but nevertheless, he oversees the signature of a very sophisticated document and claims that somehow that the maker of the document, the signer on the document, knew what was going on. But I have lots of different experiences. It's surprising. And when family members hear of these things and they find out they've been cut out, it's like, are you kidding me? There are lawyers that would really do this? Well, there are some.
Yeah, I get it. It is really it's disturbing, is what it is. Michael's book is called Alzheimer's, Widowed Stepmothers, and Estate Crimes: Cause, Action, and Response in Cases of Fractured Inheritance, Lost Inheritance, and Disinheritance. If you want more information, you can go to hackardlaw.com. So talk a little bit about some of the things that, if you have a parent who does have Alzheimer's, what could you do? What could you be doing to protect you?
Okay, first of all, try to have transparency fully on their estate plan. And even if a parent has Alzheimer's, they still may have sufficient capacity to make an estate plan or to change an estate plan. We've gone so far as at times to have such a parent interviewed by a geriatric psychiatrist just to show and to have a record that there is sufficient capacity. But the danger areas is to look out for unpaid bills and checks or documents with unfamiliar signatures. I had a case once where a woman in her 90s was to be paying her caregiver, I think, $2,000 a month, $1,000 every 2 weeks. And what the caregiver was doing was presenting a $1,000 check per day and telling the senior that was her paycheck for the month or for half the month. And I think that she took close to $100,000 in about 4 months. So the other thing, you've got to really watch if the phone calls are being cut off, the visits are being prohibited, or the constant presence of the caregiver. I talked about baby monitors. Just those things you've just got to watch, and also understand that none of us virtually are prepared to deal with it. So if you can, seek out counsel, but even in seeking out counsel, the counsel won't necessarily know what to do. I mean, I know a lot of the things to do, but I still see cases that there's not much I can do, not yet.
Now, you talk about situations where you feel like it's in the best interest to remove somebody that's a trustee. And you give the example of a trustee has an addiction problem. Obviously, is probably going to make questionable decisions. How do you even go about doing that, especially if it's maybe a family member?
What you try to get those?
Probably a family member.
Yeah, it's probably a family member, and because it's very common that dependent children, I say dependent, and the children may not be working; they're living at home with the parent. They really don't have any income. It's the parent who's paying for their meals and their lodging. So when those people are, and oftentimes addicted to alcohol or drugs, when they get to be the trustees, you know that estate, that trust, whether the person's living or not, it's going the wrong way. It's just going the wrong way. So oftentimes it'll be the sibling, a sober sibling of that person, who will be able to bring an action in almost any of the states where this occurs to remove that trustee. Now, most of the time, the courts are going to prefer that the replacement trustee be a professional trustee, and then states have different licensing statutes on that. It's hard to, I've done it before, but it's very hard to replace one sibling with another sibling, because the court will oftentimes treat that like, I don't want to get in the middle of this family argument, but we're going to put somebody in there who is safe.
Well, unfortunately, things can get messy, and you really need to know what you're doing. And being aware is the first place to start. That's what Michael does with his book, Alzheimer's, Widowed Stepmothers, and Estate Crimes. If you want more information, hackardlaw.com. Michael, so good to have you on the program.
Thank you for having me.